I'm Peter Drummey, the Stephen T. Riley Librarian of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and what I plan to do in the next few minutes is to try to answer the questions of why historical artifacts resonate in our imagination and what they say to us by showing you two items from our collection: a relic from George Washington's military career, the epaulets he wore at the Battle of Yorktown, and then an early portrait of George Washington from approximately the same time. Now you might ask, why George Washington at the Massachusetts Historical Society? And I think to answer that question, we have to go back to the founding of the Historical Society in 1791, where in the birth announcement of the Historical Society, a circular letter, the founders set out as their purpose: a society has lately been instituted in this town called the Historical Society, the professed design of which is to collect, preserve, and communicate materials for a complete history of this country and accounts of all valuable efforts of human ingenuity and industry from the beginning of its settlement. So the purpose of the Historical Society was, at its founding, to collect the national history, not simply the history of Massachusetts. In the earliest publications of the Historical Society, that began the following year in 1792, the first important publication published by the Historical Society was an account written by one of the early members, Thomas Pemberton, an historical account of the American War. That is, a chronological history of the Revolution. It's not simply the battles of Bunker Hill and the siege of Boston, but a complete history of the Revolution in which George Washington is the principal character. So the Historical Society had staked out this ground of collecting the national history from its beginning. And it very early on acquired documents and artifacts for this purpose. Among the most wonderful things in our collections, a gift to the Historical Society in 1804, are the epaulets George Washington wore, both at the Battle of Yorktown, the great victory at the end of the American Revolution, and then 2 years later, in December of 1783, when he resigned his commission as commander of the American Army. And they're in this wonderful leather box made especially in London for them, gilt lame and silk, weighty, heavy in your hands, wonderful to look at closely, to pick up, with buttonholes to attach to your uniform. Washington was concerned, as leader of the Revolutionary Army, to wear the uniform and have the insignia that would indicate his rank. Over 8 years, he had a real struggle to make a professional army, and he thought the uniform, in some sense, made the man or made the commander. Now, these epaulets came to the Historical Society as a gift from one of Washington's aides, Colonel David Humphreys. Humphreys was from Connecticut. He's one of Washington's aides during the Revolution. During the 8 years of the Revolution, Washington surrounded himself with hand-picked staff members, young, talented men who acted as his aides, the most famous of whom is probably Alexander Hamilton, but people who played an important role in the Revolution. Washington referred to his staff and his aides as his family, and some people have seen that as an extension of his real family. Washington had no children of his own, and some people see these aides as his serving in the place of sons. Whether that's true or not, it's certainly the case that of more than 30 young aides over the course of the Revolution, David Humphreys was one of, or perhaps his favorite. In fact, the other aides referred to Humphreys as beloved of Washington. Humphreys was a soldier poet, one of the Connecticut wits, young men who had gone to Yale before the Revolution and were active in the beginnings of American literature. After the Revolution, Washington was at Yorktown with Washington, was with him when he resigned his commission in Annapolis, and then lived at Mount Vernon after the Revolution with Washington, was a family intimate, began to write a biography of Washington. Washington, who was very careful not to show favoritism, not to have personal patronage, not to show himself as to favoring one person or one part of the country over the other, both in his public life and in his military career, nevertheless saw that Humphreys received important appointments after the Revolution representing the United States in France, and then later on during Washington's own presidency and the presidency of John Adams in Spain and Portugal. Humphreys had an important diplomatic career, returned to America in 1801, and although he spent the rest of his life developing the wool industry in America, he had introduced merino sheep from Spain to America. He had a home here in Boston and spent part of the year here. So in 1804, Humphreys writes to the Historical Society and offers the gift of these epaulets that have been passed down to him from Washington. And I think he gives a good, succinct explanation of what purpose they serve. He writes to John Eliot, the secretary of the Historical Society, "I put into your hands a pair of epaulets which were in habitual use by General Washington at the successful siege of Yorktown in Virginia, and which were worn by him on the day when he resigned his commission of Commander-in-Chief to Congress after the close of the Revolutionary War. These may, therefore, without employing a very bold figure of speech, be denominated the dumb and imperishable witnesses of his glory as a hero and a patriot." And I think that's how they were given and how they were understood when they were received, that these were artifacts that connected the members of the Historical Society directly with Washington himself. Go forward about 30 years, in 1835, and the Historical Society receives another gift, a wonderful portrait of Washington by Joseph Trumbull. This portrait had been commissioned by Thomas Jefferson. Just as the Historical Society, the rooms of the Historical Society are lined with portraits and busts of historical figures, past members of the Historical Society. In our reading room, we're surrounded by people who inform us about American history. Jefferson had the same plan for his residence, Monticello. So when he was on his way to Paris to represent the United States after the Revolution, passing through Philadelphia, he requested that Joseph Wright, sculptor and portrait painter in Philadelphia, copy a portrait that Wright had made of Washington in 1783 for Jefferson, so Jefferson would have that at Monticello. And then Jefferson was off to France. In fact, Wright only had time to do the head and hands of this portrait, and another portrait painter, former soldier in the Revolution, John Trumbull, painted the uniform. Unfortunately, the uniform doesn't show the epaulets that we have for Washington. The uniform's correct. But this is an interesting portrait because both Washington and Wright describe it. Washington, who had been by this time painted so many times that he referred to going to the painter's chair, being restless when he was young and had to sit for a portrait. But by the time Wright painted him, he had become so used to sitting for portraits that he approached the painter's chair as the draft horse approaches the wagon as simply part of his burden. But Washington wrote about this Wright portrait, the portrait that our copy was made from, describing it when Washington was asked to recommend someone to paint a portrait of him. He said, "Wright is thought to have, on a former occasion, to have taken a better likeness of me than any other painter has done. His forte seems to be in giving distinguishing characteristics with more boldness than delicacy. He commonly marks the features very strongly." Jefferson, who also had a portrait of a younger George Washington taken at the beginning of the Revolutionary War by Charles Wilson Peale, preferred this one by Wright. He called it a better likeness because it shows him, that is Washington, as he was in moments of his gravest difficulties. And that's a keen insight because it's not during the military operations of the Revolution, perhaps, that Washington was under the greatest burden, but in the period in which the painting was made, that is the period after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, but before the formal peace that ended the Revolution in 1783. So this portrait belonged to Jefferson, and in Jefferson's lifetime would have been hanging at Monticello. At Jefferson's death, as we know, his finances were somewhat complicated, and his Randolph descendants, in order to keep the property at Monticello intact, sold Jefferson's personal possessions. His paintings were brought to Boston in the early 1830s and auctioned off here. And members of the Historical Society and friends purchased 4 paintings that belonged to Washington and gave them to the Historical Society. So this wonderful portrait came to us in 1835. And later in the 19th century, when our present building was under construction, it of course was joined by an immense collection of Jefferson's personal papers that are here, but that's another story. So, just in thinking about these artifacts that are here at the Historical Society, and we have, ever since these early acquisitions, continued to collect artifacts, portraits. We have now 5 portraits of Washington, and hundreds of letters written by Washington, both letters that are scattered through collections of personal papers that we hold, but also individual documents that we've collected. We've assembled this very important Washington collection here, faithful to the founding of the Historical Society. Do these artifacts, do they speak to us? No, I think that Humphreys had it almost exactly right. These are dumb witnesses. It's knowing the stories of their provenance, knowing how they connected through persons over time to the Historical Society that really tells about them. And last, going back to that circular letter of the Historical Society at the time of our founding, the members of the Historical Society were pleased to point out, only a few months after their first meeting, that in pursuance of their plan, they had already amassed a large quantity of books, pamphlets, and manuscripts, and were still in search of more, and were still in search of more.